I want to start by telling you something that sounds impossible. I have watched a human being catch a kinetic bolt with his forearm, not deflect it, not dodge it, catch it, and then keep walking. Not stumble, not fall, not cry out. Keep walking. His name was Sergeant Marcus Osai. He was assigned to us as a diplomatic protection specialist, a bodyguard in the most stripped-down language possible. He was quiet. He was polite. He said yes sir and no sir and after you, ambassador, in a voice so flat and calm it sounded like a river that had forgotten how to hurry. We didn't understand what he was. None of us did, not for a long time. By the time we figured it out, by the time the reality of his biology and his history, and the planet that made him crashed into our understanding like a freighter without braking thrusters, it was almost too late. This is what happened on Orbis 9. This is what I saw with my own eyes, and I am telling you, with all four of them wide open and my tertiary heart still beating too fast when I remember it. Humans are not what they look like. Set up. Orbis 9 is not a pretty station. If you have never been there, consider yourself fortunate. It exists in the gravitational shadow of a dead binary star system, about 40 light-years from the nearest hegemony administrative hub. It was built 300 cycles ago as a neutral ground for species who had things to trade, but didn't trust each other enough to meet anywhere that mattered. It has expanded since then, added rings, added habitats, added 17 different atmospheric processing systems to accommodate 17 different biological requirements. And the result is a station that looks like something built by a committee of creatures who hated each other, which is essentially accurate. The outer rings are open market. Traders, scavengers, information brokers, species who exist in a legal gray area that the hegemony has chosen to ignore because ignoring them is cheaper than enforcing anything. The inner rings are where the formal diplomatic suites are. Those corridors are cleaner. The air recyclers actually work. The floors are something approximating flat. We arrived, Ambassador Dorvan, myself, our cultural attaché Senelaris, our communications officer Praxandal, and our four-member protective detail, via a hegemony transit shuttle on the 14th day of the current diplomatic cycle. Our mission was simple in the way that simple things always are right before they become complicated. Negotiate a trade corridor agreement with the Durac sovereignty, represent Valency interests in a border arbitration with the Peller Collective, and attend the ceremonial signing of a multi-species fishing rights compact that had taken 30 years to draft and would probably be violated within 6. Simple things. Sergeant Marcus Osai was not with us at the start. He was assigned to our protective detail on the 3rd day of our stay, after one of our original security personnel developed an acute reaction to Orbis 9 atmospheric processing blend, something in the nitrogen-sulfur ratio that the Valency respiratory system handles poorly in prolonged exposure. Our contracted security liaison, a hegemony intermediary named Clerk Basosi, arranged a replacement through the standard diplomatic exchange protocols. Your new specialist arrives at 600 station time, Clerk Basosi told Ambassador Dorvan. He comes highly recommended, former military, multiple deployments. He's currently contracted through the Diplomatic Protection Bureau. What species? The ambassador asked. Clerk Basosi consulted his data pad. Human. Ambassador Dorvan made the Valency equivalent of a shrug, a slow, rolling motion of the secondary shoulders. Fine, as long as he's professional. They always are, said Clerk Basosi. The humans who end up in protective detail work, the ones who aren't professional tend to not last. At the time, I thought that was a comment about workplace attrition. I did not understand it was a comment about survival. Sergeant Marcus Os arrived at exactly 600. Not 601, not 559, 600. I was at the corridor junction when he came through the inner ring security checkpoint. He had already cleared outer ring processing, which in itself takes most species at least 2 hours, but he had somehow moved through it in 40 minutes. I learned later that this was because he had spoken to the checkpoint officer in the officer's native Durack Creole dialect, using the specific honorific for a shift supervisor, and had very quietly produced not just his diplomatic credentials, but also a second verification document that I never did manage to identify, which the checkpoint officer had looked at for a long moment before waving him through without the standard biometric delay. I didn't know any of that at the time. I just saw him come through the door. He was not particularly large by galactic standards. The Durack are 3 meters tall and built like geology. Even the Peller, small as they are, have a density to them that makes them feel bigger than their frames suggest. Sergeant Osai was medium height for a human. I would learn later that this was roughly 1.85 of the standard meters, and lean in the way that certain functional things are lean. Not thin, not fragile, lean. The way a cable under tension is lean. He wore the standard dark gray of contracted diplomatic security. He carried a single bag, compact and structured, over one shoulder. He had what I would come to understand was a Valency-registered personal sidearm holstered at his hip, already cleared and registered, and a small flat case attached to his left forearm that I did not ask about until later. His face was, I will try to describe this accurately, because Valency physiognomic reading was designed for Valency faces, not human ones, and we miss things. His face was calm. Not the calm of something empty. The calm of something that had, at some previous point in its existence, been through enough versions of bad situations that it had developed its own internal weather system, and that weather system was currently set to mild with low wind and a temperature that would not kill you. His eyes, humans have 2 eyes, which our medical literature describes as a vulnerability, and which I now understand as something else entirely. His eyes moved through our diplomatic suite's entrance corridor in a single slow sweep that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He looked at every door, every junction, every piece of furniture, every one of us. Then he set his bag down, stood with his hands loose at his sides, and said, "Good morning. I'm Sergeant Osai, Diplomatic Protection Bureau, assigned to Ambassador Dorvan's security detail effective today. Can someone take me to the ambassador?" His voice was low, even, the kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud because it's already assumed that you're going to listen. I took him to the ambassador. Ambassador Dorvan greeted him with the formal Valency diplomatic welcome, the 3-tier hand extension, the secondary eye contact, the spoken acknowledgement of service. Most non-Valency contractors respond to this with some degree of confusion or overcorrection. Sergeant Os responded by dipping his chin in a motion that I recognized, later, as the human equivalent of a respectful acknowledgement, adapted on the spot to something that communicated the same register of deference our formal welcome was asking for. The ambassador noticed. She was good at noticing things. "You're familiar with Valency formal protocols," she said. "I read the briefing materials," he said. "Most contractors don't." "I do," he said without inflection. It wasn't pride, it wasn't showing off, it was just information. Ambassador Dorvan regarded him for a moment with her primary eyes, while her secondary eyes conducted their own assessment. Valency 4-eyed biology means we're always running 2 different visual tracks. The primary pair handles what you're looking at directly, and the secondary pair handles peripheral movement and behavioral microsignals. The ambassador's secondary eyes were doing what they always do in an initial assessment, measuring the space between this person's words and their body. "My previous bodyguard," she said, "had 17 years of experience and excellent credentials. She was incapacitated by the atmospheric processing system." "Yes, ma'am. I reviewed the incident report. I noticed that the ventilation cycling in the 3rd ring corridor section uses a sulfur-nitrogen compound that differs from hegemony standard by about 12%. I've already flagged our designated corridors with the station facilities manager and requested a recalibration. They said they'd have it done by 1400. The ambassador blinked all four eyes slowly, which in Valency body language is the equivalent of a long pause to process something. "You've been on the station for 40 minutes, she said. 43 minutes, he said. I stopped to review the station layout on the transit. His first full day on the detail was, by any objective measure, uneventful. He conducted a security assessment of our suite and the 3 corridors we used most frequently. He spoke to the station security liaison, the inner ring checkpoint officers, and the facilities maintenance coordinator. He reviewed our upcoming schedule, the Durac preliminary meeting at 1100, the reception for the Peller delegation at 1800, the informal working dinner with the hegemony arbitration team at 2100, and he made several very small adjustments that he communicated to Ambassador Dorvan in writing. He suggested we not use the standard route to the Durac meeting hall, because the route crossed an open atrium where the ceiling structure had a sightline vulnerability. He suggested we arrive 4 minutes earlier than scheduled to the Peller reception, because that would allow us to be already present when the Peller delegation entered, which was preferable, politically and physically, to arriving after them. He recommended that the working dinner venue be changed from the station's designated diplomatic restaurant to the smaller private conference room on Inner Ring 3, because the restaurant had 9 external entry points, and the conference room had 2. He phrased all of this in the language of suggestions. He never pushed, he just laid it out. The ambassador approved all 3. Our cultural attaché Senelaris, who had done this work for a long time and was deeply skeptical of new security personnel, watched all of this with the particular expression she had when something had surprised her, but she wasn't ready to admit it yet. "He's thorough," she said to me, when Sergeant Os I had left to do a walkthrough of the dinner venue. "He is," I agreed. "Most of them just stand there and look intimidating," she said. "He does that too," I said. "He just does other things as well." Senelaris made a noncommittal sound, but she stopped arguing about the route change. That night late, after the working dinner, after we had returned to our suite, and the formal obligations of the day had been discharged, I found myself in the common area of our diplomatic quarters, unable to sleep. Orbis 9 runs on a standardized 26-hour day cycle, and my Valency biology, accustomed to a 30-hour cycle, tends to throw itself sideways in the first few days of adjustment. Sergeant Os was sitting at the small table near the entrance, which was where the security detail always positioned one member for overnight watch. He had a data pad in front of him, flat on the table, and a small cup of something dark and steaming that I recognized, from my limited knowledge of human beverage culture, as coffee. He looked up when I came in. He didn't startle. He had heard me before he saw me, which I would not realize until later, but which was evident in the fact that he had already recalibrated to my presence before I came through the door. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Cycle adjustment," I said. "My apologies for disturbing your watch." "You're not disturbing it," he said. "You want some coffee." I declined politely. I sat down at the far end of the table with a mild tisane I had prepared in the small galley, and we sat in the kind of companionable quiet that sometimes happens between beings who are not trying to impress each other. After a while, I asked him where he was from. "Ghana," he said, "West Africa." "On Earth," I said. "Yes," he said. I had the standard hegemony database knowledge about Earth, which is to say the surface-level facts that anyone can access. Location, Sol system, third planet, dominant species, human, civilization age, relatively young by galactic standards, status, provisional hegemony signatories, homeworld classification, Class M habitable, mild to moderate environmental complexity. I've read the hegemony classification for Earth, I said. Class M. Right, he said. That means a mid-range environmental complexity, similar to Velen's. He made a small sound, not quite agreement. The hegemony classification system was designed by species who'd never visited Earth, he said. They based it on atmospheric composition, temperature ranges, and geological stability indices. Those are the standard metrics, I said. Yeah, he said. He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down. Our atmospheric composition is fine. Our temperature ranges are wide but technically habitable. Our geology is active but not outside the parameters. So the classification is accurate, I said. The classification measures what it measures, he said. It doesn't measure the things that aren't on its list. He said it without heat. Just matter of fact, like he was explaining a calibration error to someone who didn't know there was one. I didn't think much of it then. I would think a great deal about it later. Build tension. The Dirac preliminary meeting was straightforward. The Dirac are impressive creatures, 3 meters tall, roughly bilateral in their symmetry, with 4 upper limbs that serve a combined gripping and manipulative function, and a lower body structure that suggests something between bipedal and something else entirely. They are not warm. They communicate in a register that translates as deliberate and precise in diplomatic contexts, and deeply cold in social ones. And they have a long history of viewing species smaller than themselves as, at best, interestingly fragile. Ambassador Dorvan had dealt with Dirac before. She handled it well. Sergeant Osai stood at her left flank, in the standard security posture, present but receded, visible but not distracting. The Dirac delegation's own security detail consisted of 2 members, both Dirac, both enormous, both watching the ambassador's security with the kind of evaluative attention that is technically polite but is functionally a challenge. I watched them watch Sergeant Osei. There was a moment, about 40 minutes into the preliminary session during a recess, when the Dirac security lead moved into the corridor outside the meeting room. He was a big one, even by Dirac standards. He had decorative scarring along his upper limbs that indicated, in their culture, a specific rank of combat experience. Sergeant Osei was in the corridor already, having done a perimeter check, and the 2 of them occupied the same corridor for about 3 minutes while we refreshed our beverages and reviewed our notes inside. I was near the door and I could see them. The Dirac security lead looked at Sergeant Osei the way large, experienced creatures look at smaller, unknown ones, with a certain measuring quality that isn't quite contempt but is comfortable in the assumption of hierarchy. He said something to Sergeant Osei. I don't speak Dirac primary dialect well enough to catch it from distance, but Senalaris, who was closer, told me later that it was something approximately equivalent to, "Small species, soft planet, you are here to carry things for your diplomat." It was not technically an insult under Dirac diplomatic convention. It was a status inquiry, a probe to see where you sat. Sergeant Osei looked at the Dirac security lead for a moment. Then he said something back. Senalaris told me later that he said it in Dirac primary dialect, not the simplified trade pidgin, the primary dialect with correct honorific register and correct intonation. He said, and she paused when she translated it because she wanted to get the register exactly right, he said, "I carry nothing that isn't mine. My species is young. Our planet is complicated. I'd be grateful for your patience with us." The Dirac security lead stared at him. Grateful for your patience with us is, in Dirac primary, a phrase with a specific cultural weight. It is what a combat veteran says to a superior before a joint operation. It acknowledges the superior's experience while simultaneously establishing your own. It is humble in form and to someone who knows the culture, not humble at all in substance. The Durek security lead stared at Sergeant Osai for a long moment. Then he made a sound deep, resonant, somewhere between a rumble and a click, which Senalaris told me was the Durek equivalent of a surprised, respectful laugh. He said one word, she translated it as noted, and went back inside. When I mentioned this to Sergeant Osai later, he just said, "I did some reading on the Durek before this assignment." "You speak their primary dialect," I said. "Enough to be polite," he said. I had been trying, for 8 years, to learn enough Durek primary dialect to be polite. I had not yet succeeded. The atmosphere changed on the 5th day. It always does on Orbis 9, when the wrong people show up. The wrong people in this case were a contingent of Galactic Sovereignty Enforcement officers, Gal-Sov-Enf, in the shorthand that station personnel use with barely concealed distaste. Gal-Sov-Enf is nominally a hegemony peacekeeping body. In practice, on a station like Orbis 9, they function as something between a protection racket and an occupying force, depending on what they want from you on a given day. This particular contingent was led by a commander named Vethara, Peller species, which would normally be relevant in the context of our ongoing negotiations with the Peller Collective, except that Gal-Sov-Enf personnel are supposed to operate independently of their species' diplomatic interests. Supposed to being the operative phrase. Commander Vethara arrived on the station with 12 officers, which is significantly more than standard for a routine peacekeeping deployment on a station this size. She established herself in the inner ring almost immediately, which is also not standard. And on the 5th day, she appeared in the corridor outside our diplomatic suite. She didn't knock. She had the station authority override the corridor access lock and walked in with 6 of her officers. Ambassador Dorvan was in the middle of a communication with Valency's central office when they came in. I was at my workstation. Senalaris was reviewing documents. Praxandal was calibrating our communication array. Sergeant Osai was standing near the suite entrance. He was there because he was always near the suite entrance when we were in the suite. I had noticed, over 5 days, that he positioned himself in specific places, never randomly, always at points that gave him sightlines to the most likely entry and exit vectors. He never explained this. It was just where he was. When the door opened without the standard chime, he moved. Not dramatically, not in a way that looked like action. He just shifted. His posture changed. His hands, which had been loosely at his sides, were no longer loosely at his sides. I couldn't have told you precisely what changed, except that something had, and it made the air in the room feel different. Commander Vethara walked in with her 6 officers and stopped when she saw him. She was a Peller. Peller are small, roughly half the height of a Valency, compact, with wide sensory organs and a dense bone structure that makes them considerably more durable than their size suggests. Commander Vethara had the look of someone who had been in authority long enough that she had stopped being aware of how she walked through rooms. She walked like the room was hers. She looked at Sergeant Osai. He looked at her. "Move," she said, not aggressive, just flat. The word of someone who was used to things moving when she said it. "This is a hegemony-designated diplomatic suite under temporary embassy jurisdiction," Sergeant Osai said. His voice was what it always was, even, low, unhurried. "Entry without announcement or prior coordination is a protocol violation under Section 7 of the Diplomatic Premises Code. I'll need to ask you to wait in the corridor while I inform the ambassador of your presence." Commander Vethara looked at him for a moment. "I have station authority override." "For public station areas," he said. "Not for designated diplomatic premises. The override doesn't extend here. If you'd like me to pull the relevant code, I can do that." He wasn't aggressive about it. He wasn't emotional about it. He said it the way you say something that is simply and verifiably true, which is somehow more immovable than saying it any other way. Commander Vethara's 6 officers shifted. They were Gal-Sov-Inf standard, armored species varied. The one nearest Sergeant Osa was a Thar, which is a species that tends toward recruitment in security roles because of their physical dimensions and their genuinely impressive ability to project threat. The Thar officer looked at Sergeant Osa and did the thing Thar do when they want to communicate dominance. He straightened to his full height, which was roughly 2.5 meters, and let out a low subsonic frequency that most species register as an instinctive threat signal. Sergeant Osai did not move. He just stood there, relaxed, watching Commander Vethara. The Thar officer produced the subsonic again, slightly louder. Sergeant Osai glanced at him, one quick look, then back to Commander Vethara. Like the Thar officer had said something mildly interesting, but not particularly relevant to the current conversation. Something happened in that moment. I saw it. The Thar officer saw it too. I could tell because he went slightly still, the way things go still when they've received an unexpected signal. The signal was this. Sergeant Osai had looked at him and then looked away. In the threat language that most species speak without knowing they speak it, that means, I see you. You are not the concern right now. Not because the Thar officer was safe, because he was manageable. The Thar officer didn't know what to do with that. Ambassador Dorvan had come to the suite entrance by this point, having extracted herself from her communication. She was poised in the way she was always poised, composed, radiating the specific calm that comes from decades of diplomatic experience, and she looked at Commander Vethara with all 4 eyes. "Commander," she said, "this is unexpected." "Ambassador." Commander Vethara turned her attention from Sergeant Osai, though I noticed she did it the way you turn your attention from something you intend to come back to. "I have business to discuss, regarding your current negotiations with the Durak." "I'd be happy to schedule a formal meeting," the ambassador said. "My secretary can find time tomorrow." "Now," said Commander Vethara, "this is a Gal-Sov-Inf operational matter. It takes precedence." Sergeant Osai had moved again, not dramatically, just a shift, so that he was standing in the space between Commander Vethara and the ambassador. Not blocking, not aggressive, just present in the space that, if things went in a certain direction, would be the space they needed to go through. Commander Vethara noticed. Her eyes moved to him, back to the ambassador. "Your bodyguard," she said, "is going to get himself into trouble." "My security officer," said Ambassador Dorvan, with a very slight and very precise emphasis on the word security, that communicated both a correction and a warning, "is doing his job. As am I, I'd like to extend you the courtesy of a formal meeting at a mutually agreeable time, Commander. If you prefer to escalate this to the Hegemony Arbitration Office, that's also available to you." The Hegemony Arbitration Office was the one entity on Orbis 9 that Gal-Sov-Inf could not override. Invoking it was a flag, a very polite flag, a flag that said, "Push this, and we will make it formal and public and difficult for you." Commander Vethara looked at the ambassador, looked at Sergeant Osai, did some kind of internal calculation. "Tomorrow," she said, 1000 station time, don't be late." She left, her 6 officers left, the door closed. The suite was very quiet for a moment. Praxandal let out a long breath. Senelaris pressed her primary hands together. I realized I had been holding 2 of my 4 lungs in a kind of held suspension, and I let them go. Ambassador Dorvan looked at Sergeant Osai. "Thank you," she said. "Ma'am," he said. "The Thar officer," she said. "He was trying to intimidate you." "Yes, ma'am." "Did it work?" Sergeant Os considered this for a moment. It was the only time I ever saw him take time to find an accurate answer to what might have been considered a rhetorical question. "I was aware of it," he said finally. "I wouldn't say it worked." He said it simply, without bravado, and it was somehow the least bravado-sounding statement of confidence I have ever heard, which made it land harder than anything theatrical would have. The ambassador held his gaze for a moment with her primary eyes. "I want you to know," she said, "that I've read your service record." Something shifted in his face, very small, barely visible, the kind of micro-movement that Valency's secondary eyes catch and primary eyes miss. "You don't have clearance for most of it," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I have clearance for some of it, and what I read was," she paused, choosing the word carefully the way she chose all her words carefully, "instructive." He didn't respond to that. She went back to her office. I looked at Sergeant Osei. He had already returned his attention to the door, in the calm, settled way he always did, like a thing that had oriented itself and was now exactly where it was supposed to be. I asked Clerk Bassosi about Sergeant Osei that evening. Not about his service record, I knew I couldn't access that. I asked about his background, his training, his origin. Clerk Bassosi was a careful being. He'd been running intermediary services on Orbis 9 for a long time, and beings who survive that long in that role tend to be very specific about what they say and don't say, and in what order. But he told me one thing. "When I submitted his name to your ambassador's office," he said, "I included a note in the file, a classification." "What classification?" He looked at me for a moment. "Deathworlder," he said. I looked at him. "Deathworlder," I repeated. "It's a hegemony internal designation," he said. "For protection specialists, military, law enforcement, contracted security, who originate from planets that carry an extreme environmental designation, EED. Most of the species in the hegemony don't qualify. The criteria are significant." "What are the criteria?" I asked. "A planet that produces ED designation life must have a persistent, active evolutionary pressure above a certain threshold index. Meaning, life on that planet does not survive by default. It survives by competing, against everything, against the planet, against the atmosphere, against other life, for sustained periods, across all scales, microscopic, ecological, geological." He paused. "Earth qualifies," he said. "Earth is classified Class M," I said, "mid-range complexity." "By the old system," he said. "There was a reclassification proposal 3 cycles ago. It's still in committee. The hegemony is slow to change classification systems, but the internal designation changed." "What's the current internal designation?" He told me. I stared at him. "That's the same classification as Durek Prime," I said. "Yes," said Clerk Bassosi. Durek Prime was a planet where 3-meter apex predators had evolved as the dominant intelligence. "That's not possible," I said. "Humans are their average size, they're soft-bodied, they don't have significant physical defenses, they don't have." "No," Clerk Bassosi agreed. "They don't. No natural armor, no venom, no extreme strength by the standards of most large-bodied species. No passive environmental resistances." "Then how?" "Because they didn't need any of those things," he said. "Because the planet was so comprehensively hostile that it produced something else entirely, something that compensated differently." He was quiet for a moment. "The way I understand it," he said, "and I've spoken to a few xenobiologists about this over the years, Earth didn't produce a species that could resist the threats. It produced a species that could adapt to anything, and not just physically, not just biologically, cognitively, behaviorally. Humans process threat in a way that most species don't. Most species have a threat response that is reactive, stimulus and response. Your threat response, Valency threat response, Peller threat response, they're all fast and effective, but they're reactive. Something bad happens, you respond." "And humans?" I asked. "Humans are anticipatory," he said. "They predict, they plan, they run simulations in their heads of what might go wrong before it goes wrong, It's called, I think the human term is paranoia, but that's a pathological framing. The baseline human cognitive state involves persistent low-level threat modeling. They're always, in some portion of their processing, asking, what's the worst thing that could happen right now and how do I survive it? He let that sit for a moment. That sergeant of yours, he said, he's not just a trained soldier, he's a trained soldier from a death world. That means his baseline, before any training, before any professional development, that baseline is already higher than most species' upper limit. I thought about the way Sergeant Osai had moved when the door opened without the chime. I thought about the way he'd looked at the Thar officer and then looked away. I thought about the 43 minutes in which he had cleared security, reviewed the station layout, identified the ventilation issue in our corridor, flagged it with facilities, and arrived at exactly 600. Why didn't you put this in the briefing materials? I asked. Clerk Basosi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because diplomatic protection is about projecting calm. If the ambassador's staff were anxious about their protector, that would undermine the function. And besides, he paused. Most species, when they hear Deathworlder, think it means something dramatic, something obvious, something that looks like a weapon. It doesn't look like a weapon, I said slowly. No, he said. It looks like a man who arrived at exactly 600 and asked if you'd like some coffee. Climax. It happened in Corridor 7 on the 8th day. I want to be precise about what happened because I have told this story to 3 different people and 2 of them thought I was exaggerating. I was not. I have better than average recall for a valency. All 4 of my sensory channels store information independently and then cross-reference. And I have reviewed what I remember with the station security footage that I was eventually given access to, and my memory is accurate. The 8th day was the day of the Durack formal treaty signing. It was a significant ceremony. The trade corridor agreement we had been negotiating for 7 months was to be formalized that morning, a document signing in the main treaty chamber on Inner Ring 2. Ambassador Dorvan, the Durack senior diplomat Grev Haron, and representatives from 3 other interested species were all present. The station was at its maximum diplomatic occupancy. Every species with a stake in regional trade lanes had sent observers. Galsav Inf had been conspicuous all morning, more personnel than the previous days. Commander Vethara had not appeared at the 1,000 meeting she had demanded. She had sent a subordinate with a vague statement about ongoing operational matters, and the ambassador had received it with a politeness that I could see she did not feel. Sergeant Os had been quiet all morning, more quiet than usual, which was already quiet. He had changed our route to the treaty chamber twice, not dramatically, just small adjustments, corridors he preferred, junctions he wanted to pass through in specific sequences. He had spoken, briefly, with the station's own security coordinator before we left our suite, in a murmured conversation that I couldn't hear and didn't ask about. The signing ceremony went smoothly, 47 minutes. Ambassador Dorvan signed for Velens. Grev Haron signed for the Durack sovereignty. 3 observers signed as witnesses. Photographs, the multi-species equivalent thereof, were taken. It was, as those events go, a success. We were returning to our suite via Corridor 7, a secondary corridor in the inner ring, which Sergeant Os had substituted for our usual route about an hour before, when it happened. Corridor 7 is a long straight passage. Inner ring standard construction, hard composite walls, overhead light panels, emergency alcoves at regular intervals. Low traffic, especially during formal ceremonies when most station personnel were at or near the treaty chamber. We were about 2/3 of the way down it when the lights changed. Not went out, changed. They dropped to a lower frequency, shifted toward the red end of the visible spectrum. Station emergency mode. A soft tone began, not an alarm, just the subtle prelude tone that in Orbis 9 system indicates a security protocol activation. Sergeant Osai had already moved. I do not know how he knew before the lights changed. I have watched the security footage from 4 angles, and I cannot determine it from the footage. All I know is that by the time the lights shifted, he was no longer at the ambassador's left flank. He was in front of her, 1 step ahead, his hand on the compact case on his left forearm. "Alcove," he said to the ambassador, "quiet, no drama, 3 steps behind me now." She moved. She trusted him completely at that point. 7 days of seeing what he was had built something that went past professionalism into something more useful than that. I was behind her. Senalaris and Praxindal were behind me. And then the 3 figures came from the corridor junction ahead. Galsav Inf uniforms, not Commander Vethara, I didn't see her, but her officers, and they were not in standard deployment formation. They were in something else. Something that didn't have a polite diplomatic name. The first officer raised a kinetic dispersal weapon, a model I recognized from the Hegemony security catalog. Technically, a non-lethal crowd control device, but non-lethal at close range in a contained corridor with multiple civilians is a phrase that requires significant qualification. They were not pointing it at Sergeant Osai. They were pointing it at the ambassador. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. I have gone over it many times. Sergeant Os had the compact case open before the weapon completed its targeting sweep. The case contained, I would learn later, a personal shield generator, the kind contracted diplomatic security personnel are cleared to carry. He had it deployed in under a second, a flat hexagonal panel that he braced with his left forearm. The weapon discharged. The kinetic bolt hit the shield and fragmented. The shield absorbed the center mass of it, but the dispersal ring caught Sergeant Osai's right forearm at the shield's edge. I saw it hit. He didn't fall. He didn't stumble. He took 1 short step back, absorbing the impact through his whole body the way you absorb a wave, distributed the energy, didn't let it accumulate, and then he was moving forward. Not fast in the way of species built for speed. Fast in the way of something that had made a decision and was now executing it without any wasted steps. He covered the distance to the first officer in what felt like no time at all. The second officer tried to reorient the weapon. Sergeant Os was inside the weapon's effective range before the reorientation completed, which is where a kinetic dispersal weapon's design becomes a liability, and he did something with his right elbow and his left hand that happened too quickly for me to track with my primary eyes. My secondary eyes caught some of it. The first officer was on the ground. The weapon was in Sergeant Osai's left hand. The second officer backed up. The third officer reached for a secondary weapon, a contact stunner. Sergeant Osai said, "Don't." 1 word, the same voice he always used, even low. The third officer didn't.